An illegal brain surgery is taking place in this abandoned temple. While the surgery is going on in a very tense atmosphere, the female doctor suddenly asks her assistant to wake the patient up immediately. This action is extremely dangerous and can cause the patient to die at any time. However, this is the extremely domineering surgical style of this young female doctor. She performs surgery while talking to the patient to find the exact location of the tumor. Finally, after a while of effort, the patient miraculously survived. What few people know is that this female doctor is actually a rare medical genius. Her name is Seok. Although she is a genius, she always performs illegal surgeries. The reason she has to do so is because of her evil teacher. Deok is a leading neurosurgeon in Korea. Today, he also performed a brain tumor removal surgery. While the surgery was going on, an assistant accidentally saw Professor Deok's eyes twitching continuously. Unexpectedly, just a moment of distraction caused the assistant to be angrily chased out by the professor. However, the surgery was a success. As soon as Professor Deok went out, the police came to see him. The police were investigating Chairman Min-sik, a broker who arranged illegal surgeries. The police raided his surgery facility and found a video that looked like a brain surgery, but they didn't understand what kind of surgery it was, so they came to ask Professor Deok. The professor's assistant, Woo Young, confirmed that this surgery was extremely difficult and could not be performed in such a makeshift operating room. Moreover, in Korea, only Professor Deok could have succeeded, so this patient must have died. Professor Deok didn't comment, only promised to review it more carefully. When the police left, the assistant said that the hand in the video looked like a woman's hand. He wondered if it was Professor Deok's student, Seok. Professor Deok was annoyed and sent the assistant away. Then he immediately called his assistant Nahi to ask to find a person named Min-sik who specializes in illegal surgery brokers. Nahi promised to find Min-sik in a week, but Deok said it was urgent, so the sooner the better. The mafia boss's surgery was a success. Seok visited him and asked how many fingers it was, but he didn't answer and only thanked her. Meanwhile, Nurse Miran was happily counting the money after operating on the mafia boss, but when she saw that there was only 5 million won, she seemed unhappy. A moment later, Miran came to provoke Seok. It turned out that the two didn't know each other, but Miran had heard rumors about Seok and Professor Deok. Seeing Miran's evil smile, Seok just kept quiet. While eating, Seok asked assistant Youngju and found out that Miran was a nurse hired by the gang. Miran was once fired from the hospital for negligence, so she had to work at a nursing home. There, she mistreated mute and paralyzed patients and was eventually fired. Miran had no choice but to participate in illegal surgery like this, so she probably wouldn't dare to expose them. At this time, Miran entered the hospital room and injected the boss with some kind of medicine. Then, Miran went through Seok's wallet and found her business card. It turned out that Seok opened a pharmacy to do business because her medical license had been revoked a long time ago. Miran continued to provoke her about Professor Deok, but Seok didn't pay any attention. When Seok entered the hospital room, she saw that the boss was lying unconscious. Miran admitted to injecting him with sleeping pills because everyone was watching. That was the only way the two could talk privately. Miran said she only received 5 million won. Seok's salary must be much higher. Then Miran demanded that Seok give her 2 million won every month or she would call the police. Miran told Seok that the two of them were partners, so Seok had to give her at least that much money. Seok thought for a few seconds and then agreed. Seok needed a nurse. Anyway, unexpectedly, Miran said she wouldn't be a nurse anymore. The 2 million won was just a confidentiality fee. For her own safety, Seok smirked and said that you will send me your bank account number later. On this side, Nahi took Professor Deok to meet Chairman Min-sik. After watching the video, he said that this surgery had nothing to do with him and the Chinese people who sent him this video, asking them to find the doctor in the video. However, he refused because he was not a specialist in brain surgery. Professor Deok wanted to see the complete video to see if the surgery was successful, but Min-sik said that the Chinese had only sent him that much. In the end, Professor Deok decided to ask the surgeon directly because he already knew who it was. Nahi heard that and vaguely guessed whether it was the girl from that year. That day, Professor Deok had a dinner date with Inspector Dong-young and his wife. Dong-young praised Professor Deok for being famous as a genius in the past. Deok was from a poor family in the countryside, but was the valedictorian of medical school. When Inspector Dong-young mentioned the brain surgery video, Professor Deok suddenly had a severe headache, so he had to use the excuse of going to the bathroom to apply painkillers. Over at the abandoned temple, the thugs were collecting the trash from the past few days into a hole and burning it to destroy the traces. The machinery and equipment will be collected by Youngju and Seok. The boss's health has recovered very well, so he can be discharged today. He said he owes Seok a big favor. If she has any problems that need help, just tell him. Unexpectedly, Seok smiled and told them to solve their own problems. Finally, the subordinates put the boss in the car and went home. Hyun-ho will follow them for a week to monitor his health. Seok said that when they finish cleaning, she will let Miran go home. Hearing that, Miran thought she was about to get the money. That night, Miran couldn't find her water bottle, so she searched Seok's backpack for a bottle of water and drank it. Youngju went to get the cooler for Seok. When Youngju Youngju got downstairs, she saw her standing pensively in front of the Buddha statue. Seok acted like this cooler was very important, so she didn't let Youngju ask any questions. Seok just told Youngju to quickly bring it to Hunho. Seok also told Youngju not to open the cooler for fear of getting it dirty. At this time, there was only one blonde thug left. Seok approached him and told him to go to town to take a sauna and come back tomorrow morning to clean up. The other guy thought it was reasonable and left. Now there was only Seok and Miran left. Miran was lying unconscious after drinking water from Seok's backpack. Youngju walked to the middle of the road and remembered the scene of Seok standing pensively in front of the Buddha statue. So, he quickly pulled over to the side of the road. He opened the cooler to see. Surprisingly, it was just some ice cream sticks and nothing important, like gum. Seok said he was worried that something would happen, so he immediately turned around and drove back to the temple. At this time, Miran woke up and discovered that her backpack was gone. She panicked and ran around looking everywhere. Finally, Miran found it in the operating room. She was happily counting the money when suddenly, Seok strangled her from behind. Seok used all her strength to tighten the rope, not giving Miran any chance to resist. When Youngju got home, Seok had already finished her work. Seok calmly took Miran's pay envelope and put it in the box. Then, Seok approached Youngju and asked if he had a shovel in his car. The next morning, when Youngju got home, he was still shocked to see the shovel covered in dirt. Looking at Seok happily playing with her pet dog, who would have thought she was a murderer, when she knew that Seok was raising 3 Rottweilers, a famously ferocious breed of dog. Professor Deok laughed and said that her dogs were just like their owner. Nahi commented that Professor Deok and Seok had many similarities. Even their madness was similar. Geniuses must be like that. They both wished they would die in the operating room, right? On days when she wasn't doing illegal surgeries, Seok was the pharmacist selling medicine at her store. The old lady curiously asked where Seok had been. These past few days, Seok said that someone asked me for money, as if I owed her. The old lady asked how Seok solved it. Seok calmly replied that I strangled her to death so she wouldn't talk nonsense anymore. As soon as Seok left the shop, a guy from the restaurant across the street stared at her. His face looked like a thug, with an electronic bracelet on his leg for dangerous criminals who had just been released from prison. When he saw the police patrol car, he went inside the house. Turned out that the thug was the younger brother of the restaurant owner Ma Rai. Youngju asked why that thug was looking at her. Seok calmly said, it must be because she was beautiful. Youngju then asked if she was going to kill him. Seok jumped up and replied to Youngju that he thought she was crazy. Youngju did not hesitate to reply that she was clearly crazy. She had tricked him and killed Miran. Seok said it was only self-defense. She killed a person. Someone like that had to die like that. Then the world would be good. At this moment, Professor Deok called to say that he was about to come to Seok's house. Memories of that year came flooding back. Professor Deok chased Seok away from the surgery because she made some mistake. She stubbornly refused to go, so he ordered someone to drag her out. Seok went crazy and screamed, determined to finish her surgery. Seeing Professor Deok coldly leave, Seok chased after him, took the IV tube to strangle him. Everyone panicked and rushed in to stop her. Professor Deok slapped Seok and said that her impulsiveness was her problem, but Seok still spat on him. Professor Deok slapped her again. Then he told her that she would never step foot in the operating room, the place she wanted to live and die in. For Seok, not having surgery was no different from losing her life, so she knelt all day in front of the hospital in the pouring rain, hoping for Professor Deok's forgiveness, but he didn't change his mind and coldly walked past her. Seok could only scream in despair. Back in the present, Professor Deok came to Seok's house and brought her gifts. He kept talking about Seok's classmates. One was promoted to the position of department head, the other was a lecturer. If she were still working with him, she would be a full professor by now. Seok told him to get straight to the point. He immediately showed her the brain surgery video and complimented her on her progress. Hearing that, Seok went to cut the cake and invited him. At this time, the professor had another severe headache. He said he had a brainstem glioma. Seok asked why he didn't ask his favorite students. The professor confessed that tumor was in a very difficult position. Moreover, the surgery had to be perfect and flawless without leaving any after effects, especially these hands, because he wanted to continue doing surgery. He will find a place where she can just come and have surgery. Seok laughs loudly and says he is crazy. She does not have a license to perform surgery. Seeing Seok firmly refuse, Professor Deok threatens to report to the police that she secretly performed surgery for the mafia. Seok gets mad and tells him that he is always looking for a way to take her down. If he hates her so much, then cut off her hand. Hearing that, the professor immediately leaves. But as soon as he reaches the door, a sudden headache hits him, causing him to collapse on the steps. He intends to get the painkiller bottle, but his shaking hands drop it on the ground. Seok rushes out of the house and kicks the bottle away. Remembering the old grudge, she breaks his bottle. Still with that perverted laugh, she stomps on it over and over again, as if to vent all her anger. Only then does Youngju run out to stop him and call Professor Deok's ambulance. Everything that just happened cannot escape the eyes of Vat, the thug neighbor Shin Q. That night, Seok tosses and turns, unable to sleep. The memories of her intense youth flashed through her mind. At that time, Seok was still a resident in the neurosurgery department of the medical university. Seeing the test posted on the bulletin board, she pulled it down and did the test right there. At that time, there was an announcement that Professor Deok-hee from America was coming to teach at the university. Seok was overjoyed because Professor Deok-hee had been her idol for a long time. She immediately ran to find him. Meanwhile, the head professor of the neurology department was also telling Professor Deok-hee about Seok. She had skipped a grade to enter university at the age of 17 and even became valedictorian. But he had to be careful because that girl was a time bomb. She was not normal because once she opened her mouth, she would talk for at least an hour. She asked questions, complained, and bragged about everything, but she was very good at her job. Professor Deok-hee had just taken over the office. Before he could arrange anything, Seok came to him with a frighteningly cheerful face. She showed him the test she had just finished and asked the professor if she had done it correctly. While waiting, she took his bread and ate it while bad-mouthing the head of the department. The head of the department yawned during the surgery, and his thesis was written haphazardly, patching together other people's research. She even calmly claimed to be Professor Deok-hee's student. She said that since entering medical school, she had been waiting for him to return from Boston. Seok said that she had read all of his theses and even memorized them because every word was on point. At this moment, the professor returned the test, making her smile smugly. That night, in the room covered with knowledge about neurology, Seok looked at the test with Professor Deok-hee's perfect mark over and over again and smiled happily. She immediately ran out in the rain to the hospital to ask to be Professor Deok-hee's student. Seok wanted the professor to pass on all the knowledge and techniques he had. She had bet her whole life on this. Her dream was to die on the operating table. At that moment, Professor Deok-hee realized that Seok was just like him. They were madly in love with this field. Professor Deok-hee asked Na-hee if she had ever seen a human brain. Only by seeing it with her own eyes could she understand that the brain vibrates like the heart. It has no permanent lid and should not be cut open, but he was lucky to see it. It looked very fragile, but at the same time had an indescribable beauty and sophistication. He loved the brain so much that he was willing to die in the operating room. Na-hee guessed that Professor liked Seok very much, but he said she was annoying. Unable to convince Seok to operate on him, Professor Deok-hee went to Hunho and gave Hunho his medical records. He knew that Hunho's clinic only treated patients who were rejected by big hospitals. This hospital also regularly held volunteer medical examinations. Professor Deok-hee provoked Hunho, saying that Hunho was just like his teacher, ending up in miserable poverty, wasting his talent to take care of the homeless in this tiny clinic. Hunho was frustrated and wanted to refuse Professor Deok-hee because he should have personally performed surgery on this type of disease. Only then did the professor reveal that this was his medical record. He could not possibly perform surgery on his own brain. When Hunho brought the medical record to Seok, she refused immediately. She said to let him die. Hunho only regretted that Seok was wasting her talent. If she agreed to help Professor Deok-hee, he promised to ask the medical association to restore her license. Did she want to operate stealthily forever? But Seok told her that no big hospital would accept her because of the stain on her record. Even if she opened her own clinic, she wouldn't be able to perform surgery. She thought she was doing fine, and she liked her current situation better. That night, Seok got mad and burned all her documents and theses. She even forced Youngju to go into the house and get the rest. The clumsy guy tripped and fell, causing the theses to fall everywhere. When he picked them up, he saw that all of them had been given perfect marks, but now they were all ashes. The next morning, the thug, Shin-kyu, came to provoke Seok. He reminded her of the day she broke Professor Deok-hee's medicine bottle. He asked if she was feeling unwell. Would she like to go to Seoul to drink with him? Luckily, Seok's staff showed up, so he left. A moment later, Seok saw him beat someone up. Seok's staff said that this wasn't the first time. It was a regular occurrence. Seok immediately invited her staff to that restaurant for lunch. He would probably stop if he saw customers coming. It really worked. Shikyu sat in a corner, smiling and looking at the two girls. He even deliberately showed off the electronic anklet to the two of them. Seeing the poor boss with a bruised face, Seok's staff planned to call the police, but Seok said it would be useless. Then she said she just fell. At this time, Hinho called to report that there was a patient who needed urgent surgery tonight. Seok happily agreed right away. On this side, Youngju picked up a photo that had not burned completely. Seok in the photo was smiling brightly. Next to her were Professor Deok-hee and another female doctor. After class, Youngju went to find the female doctor in the photo. She said that was the day Seok first performed surgery. Seok was a genius, but sometimes she was also an idiot. At that time, Seok often worked overtime to replace Professor Songwoo because he was busy drinking. Everyone thought that Professor Deok-hee would give Seok a research position at Boston Medical University, but in the end, the chosen one was Ooyoung. Seok was angry and ran straight to Professor Deok-hee's room to talk. Seok met Ooyoung's mother there, and Seok cursed her for buying Seok's research position for her son. Seok also said that she was educated but acted slowly. Seeing that, Professor Deok-hee got angry and slapped Seok. After that, Seok was completely removed from all surgeries, which was the punishment she could hardly bear. Almost a year later, Professor Deok-hee was busy at a conference when the head of the department allowed Seok to operate on a patient. While Seok was performing the surgery, Professor Deok-hee returned and told her to stop. Seok calmly ignored his orders and continued to do it. When a young advised Seok, she said that the patient had been in a very serious car accident and needed emergency surgery. All the professors were absent, so Seok took it upon herself to do it. Moreover, the surgery was going very well and was almost finished. Why did the professor chase her out of the operating room while the patient was still on the operating table? But in the end, Professor Deok-hee still had someone drag Seok out. In the evening, Seok called Young-ju, but he didn't pick up. When Seok arrived at the meeting place, Hyun-ho was already waiting. The two of them immediately prepared for the surgery. However, the two of them waited all night without seeing the patient appear. Seok guessed that there was basically no patient. Sure enough, when she left, she saw Professor Deok-hee's car parked nearby. He said that he had reserved a place for her at Boston Medical University. She should go there and do all the surgeries she wanted. Seok threatened that if she operated on him, she would only need to cause a small injury to the nerve to completely paralyze his hand. But the professor wasn't afraid of that because she was too proud to make such a mistake. Seok said she would make a mistake because she hated him to the core. She hoped he would die in a corner of some remote nursing home without his family and no one to take care of him, and he would take painkillers until he lost his mind and lay in a pile of diaper waste. Then he would reminisce about his glorious past as a great man and then die. The professor said, okay, still couldn't control herself like before. She would save him anyway and go to Boston. After saying that, he told Nahi to drive away. Nahi asked him if he wasn't afraid that Seok would intentionally fail the surgery, but the professor believed that Seok would absolutely not do that. At this time, the TV reported that Professor Deok-hee might win the prestigious surgery award for the 10th time in a row. Hearing that, Seok angrily grabbed the remote and turned it off. Young-ju asked to go to Boston with her, but she said that everything of hers was here, so she wouldn't go anywhere. From the doghouse to the pharmacy and restaurant, Young-ju immediately asked which restaurant belonged to her. Seok replied that she came to eat there every day, so it was her restaurant. She also blamed Young-ju for not answering her phone calls yesterday. While Seok was bullying Young-ju, the thug Shin-kyu across the street looked over. Seok was annoyed, but still went over there for lunch. Meanwhile, Professor Deok-hee was calling to ask his student at Boston Medical University to send more painkillers. Enan Kim was busy and couldn't return to Korea right away, so he promised to let him know when he booked a ticket. The headaches were getting worse and worse. Professor Deok-hee was about to collapse. That night, Seok found Shikyu hanging around outside. She went to check and saw that corner full of cigarette packs and beer cans. It turned out that the thug had been following her for a long time. At that moment, a few men hunting wild boars came over. They said the restaurant owner was beaten up by her younger brother and kept asking for money, so she was planning to transfer the premises to split the money with him. Seok goes there to eat every day, so what should she do? She laughed and said it wasn't just that restaurant. That's what she said. But in fact, Seok was mad. She complained to Young-ju in annoyance about why people kept picking on her like that. It was her restaurant and she wanted him to die. Young-ju panicked and tried to stop her, saying that he was busy studying for exams this week, so he couldn't help her. Only then did Seok stop. The next day, she went to the restaurant and saw the owner's face was bruised. The thug was staring at her in a perverted way and showing off his leg that had been removed from the electronic bracelet. Seok pretended to leave her umbrella behind. Sure enough, he chased after her and invited her to go to Seoul for a drink, saying that they were very compatible. Seok happily made an appointment to go out for a drink tomorrow to celebrate his removal from the electronic bracelet. The next day, Seok mixed sleeping pills into a bottle of juice and drove to invite Shikyu to go out. He got in the car without any suspicion, got in the car, took the bottle of juice and drank it. He even complimented that it felt refreshing. Seok drove Shikyu straight home and told him to sit on the chair and wait for her. Shikyu soon fell asleep. When he opened his eyes, he found himself tied up on a large plastic sheet. He screamed in panic, but it was useless because a rag was stuffed in his mouth. Seok smiled and comforted him that he was okay. Then she pulled out a knife and slashed his neck. Blood splattered all over the floor and onto her face. Still that familiar perverted smile. In just a short time, Shikyu died instantly. Young-ju was studying in the library when Seok called. He immediately guessed that she had killed Shikyu. As expected, told him to go home and clean up a bit. She drove the body to a deserted forest. She turned on some music while digging the ground. Meanwhile, Young-ju hurriedly drove home and got the cleaning supplies. When she got inside, Young-ju immediately saw Shikyu's clothes and wallet wrapped in plastic. Young-ju immediately took them outside and burned them to destroy the evidence. Then he went back in and sprayed disinfectant and turned off the lights to see that many blue spots appeared on the blue floor. It proved that blood had been splattered everywhere. Young-ju panicked and used a special cleaning solution to erase all traces. At this moment, a police patrol car passed by. Seeing the large burning barrel in the middle of the night, the police officer was suspicious and went in to investigate. Luckily, Young-ju saw it and held his breath and hid inside. At this time, Seok had dug a very large hole. While she was trying her best to pull the body out, suddenly there was a flashlight in the distance, so she quickly turned off the lights and hid behind the car. Soon, the mysterious person arrived and discovered Shikyu's body. Seoke noticed him coming towards her, so she tried to rush out to attack him first, but the flashlight blinded her. When she opened her eyes, Seoke was stunned because the mysterious person was none other than Professor Deoki. Going back in time a few years before the two had any conflict. One day, Seoke saw Professor Deoki chatting happily with someone. Young said that it was his classmate from Los Angeles. Professor Moonjin also brought along his son Ki-young to introduce him to Professor Deoki. That was the first time Seoke saw Professor Deoki so happy. At that time, the research trip to Boston had not been announced yet, but Seoke was sure that it would belong to her. Young was surprised to see Professor Deoki's lamp in Seoke's dorm room. Seoke calmly said that she asked him for it. Seoke also seemed pleased because she was pampered by him, but for some reason, Seoke felt that the teacher's closeness with Professor Moonjin was suspicious. It turned out that Moonjin came here to ask Professor Deoki to perform surgery on him. The nurse said that Professor Deoki was very worried about this surgery because the patient was his friend. Seoke was shocked when she knew that the teacher did not choose her to assist in this surgery. The person chosen was Young. The next day, Seoke arbitrarily sent Young away to replace him with the excuse that he suddenly had a stomachache. When Professor Deoki asked for a scalpel, she accidentally cut his hand. The professor looked up at her with a puzzled look, but he was forced to go take care of the wound. Seoke confidently told her to take care of the rest. In the end, the surgery was a success, and Professor Deoki knew that Seoke was not careless. Seoke calmly confessed that if the surgery went wrong, his record would not be good. It was obvious that the two of them understood each other very well. She knew he intended to ruin the operation, but didn't let anyone know. So he let Young take her place as assistant because he was afraid she would notice everything. Seoke knew that Professor Deoki hated Moonjin because he looked very unnatural. Professor Deoki didn't say anything, but when he stopped her from following him, she realized that he was very angry. Seoke was too obvious when she exposed him like that. Back in the present, Seoke realized that the mysterious person was Professor Deoki and laughed triumphantly. She passed him to drag the body down the hole. He asked what if she was discovered. Did she want to go to jail? Seoke said that at worst she would die, and why care about jail? The professor still tried to convince Seo to go to Boston to start a new life, but she would rather die than operate on him. She even challenged him to call the police. The professor still needed Seoke to operate on him, so he couldn't do that. At this time, Nahi suddenly called. It turned out that she waited in the car for too long and didn't see Professor Deoki return, so she went to look for him herself. The professor stammered and distracted Nahi towards the village, but she asked what Seoke was doing earlier. Professor had to lie and say that Seoke was burying the dog. In the end, he left. Seoke continued to destroy the evidence. The next day, the police came to the restaurant to investigate Shikyu's disappearance. Just then, Seoke and Youngju were having lunch there. Police still didn't know that Shikyu was dead, but were worried that he would be removed from the electronic bracelet and harass others again. Seoke calmly said that she hadn't seen him since yesterday. When the police left, Seoke said that she was very happy because the owner wouldn't sell the restaurant anymore. Seoke still came here to eat every day. Suddenly, the staff informed them that some people had come to investigate Seoke's pharmacy. Hyunho's clinic was also investigated. It must be Professor Deoki's doing. Hyunho decided to temporarily stop illegal surgery until the situation calmed down. In the end, Seoke's pharmacy was suspended for 30 days. This made her angry. Seoke angrily called Professor Deoki to clarify everything. He said he was working in Busan. If she wanted to talk, she should go there. Seoke was so angry that she couldn't breathe. Youngju told her to breathe evenly to calm down. He told her to think about the moment in her life when she felt the most peaceful and happy. Seoke closed her eyes and immediately thought of the operating room, especially the time she worked as an assistant for Professor Deoki. Seoke was taught all of his knowledge without hiding anything. Finally, Seoke and Youngju arrived in Busan, where Professor Deoki was about to attend the Ichida Award ceremony, a prestigious medical award. Youngju hoped that one day, Seoke would become famous and be recognized. After talking to Seoke, Youngju left. A while later, Seoke went to the bathroom and accidentally heard some hot news from 3 female reporters. They said that the main sponsor of the award was Mrs. Ichida. She had a son with a serious brain disease, but no doctor was willing to operate on the child because the case was too difficult, even impossible. No one dared to risk their reputation. Seoke smiled triumphantly because she saw this as an opportunity to take revenge on Professor Deoki. Initially, Seoke planned to go see Professor Deoki tomorrow, but now she changed her mind. She saw that the professor always thought he was the best, so she had to find a way to humiliate him to wake him up. Hearing that, Youngju didn't know what else to say to Seoke, but only told Seoke not to kill him. That night, Seoke went to the hotel alone to find Mrs. Ichida. She recognized Seoke because they had met once in Tokyo. When Professor Deoki introduced the two of them to each other, Seoke entered the room and plugged the USB into the TV for Mrs. Ichida to watch the brainstem glioma surgery that she had performed. Seoke told Mrs. Ichida that 9 university hospitals had refused to perform the surgery because the child also had hemophilia. The condition was exactly like Mrs. Ichida's son, son. Performing a complicated surgery on a hemophiliac was a huge challenge, so no doctor would dare to accept it. Seok explained each step of her plan in detail. Seok said that if the boy bled while removing the tumor, the surgery would become a race against time. After saying that, Seok let Mrs. Ichida watch her operate on the patient first. The surgery lasted a total of 5 hours and 23 minutes. The child held on and survived. If she had cut even a small blood vessel during the surgery, the boy would have died from blood loss. However, Seok did not make a single mistake, but Mrs. Ichida was still worried because her son was younger than the boy in the video. She was afraid that her son would not be able to hold on, but Seok promised that she could finish within 4 hours. Seok's condition was to make Professor Deok suffer and be miserable. Mrs. Ichida heard that and immediately opened the door to see Seok off. The next morning, Seok still came to ask if she had changed her mind, but she still firmly refused. She wanted to keep the fairness of the award. She also cursed Seok as a despicable person who ruined things. Why did she have to entrust her son's life to Seok? Right after that, Seok saw her shaking hands and laughing happily with Professor Deok. Seok was extremely angry, but could do nothing. At this time, A Young happened to see Seok. A Young immediately chased after her and asked her why she came here. Seok did not say anything and drove away. Meanwhile, Dr. Inan Kim at Boston Medical School was carefully watching the video Professor Deok sent. It was an incredibly perfect surgery that Seok performed. Professor Deok called to urge Inan Kim to return to the country to participate in his surgery. Inan Kim said that if he could cooperate with her, he would accept, but the professor said that it was his honor. When Oh Young reported that he had seen Seok in the morning, Professor Deok was not surprised at all. Professor Deok only told Oh Young to arrange a seat for her at the ceremony tomorrow. During the party, Professor Deok heard someone calling him teacher. For a moment, he saw Seok again, but it was someone else. It seemed that he still cared about his former student. Mrs. Ichida came to greet Professor Deok and asked about the student he had praised so much. Surprisingly, Professor Deok did not say anything bad about Seok, but instead praised her for always being perfect. After saying that, he looked at the crowd in front of him and said that Seok was very good. She was better than 100 of them combined. He gave Seok even more praise. Seok never hesitated in the operating room and never failed. That night, Mrs. Ichida went to see Seok. She agreed to let Seok operate on her son. At the same time, Mrs. Ichida warned Seok that she would have to pay the price if she failed. Seok accepted without hesitation. Immediately after that, she called the anesthesiologist Hunho and told him to fly to Japan immediately. On this side, Mrs. Ichida took Seok and Youngju on a private plane to fly back to Japan. While she was worried and tense, Seok was extremely confident and comfortable. Before Seok entered the operating room, Mrs. Ichida bowed and asked Seok to save her son. Seok calmly greeted the young patient and set the timer. The surgery immediately began. The boy was operated on in a sitting position to reduce pressure and bleeding. Hunho also arrived promptly to support Seok with the Japanese team. While Youngju and Mrs. Ichida were anxiously waiting outside, the hemophilia suddenly flared up. The boy's blood splattered on Seok's face. The situation was so dire that the Japanese doctors demanded to stop the surgery and take the boy to the emergency room, but Seok ignored what anyone said and continued the surgery. When Mrs. Ichida rushed into the operating room, her son's blood was already spilling onto the floor. The bloody scene before her made her so worried that she couldn't speak, but Seok remained strangely calm. She focused on her knife to complete the surgery. The next day, the Ichida Award ceremony took place. Everyone was sure that Professor Deok would win the award for the 10th consecutive time, but surprisingly, the vice president of the Ichida Foundation announced that the award belonged to a Spanish doctor. While the entire hall was silent in shock, the first person to clap was Professor Deok. At this moment, Mrs. Ichida appeared, looked at Professor Deok, then turned his eyes to Seok on the other side of the stage. Seok said she had won, but Professor Deok still kept a cold, emotionless expression. Hunho reported that the boy's condition was very good. Seok was happy and pleased to have gotten revenge on Professor Deok. At this moment, they coincidentally met Ki-young, the son of Professor Moon-jin. Seok asked about Mr. Moon-jin, and Ki-young said that after the surgery that year, his father had recovered very well. Unexpectedly, one day, Ki-young returned to his room, and his father was nowhere to be found. Then Ki-young's father called and said he wanted to live alone. Since then, he has been missing without a trace. The police thought that he had just run away from home, but Ki-young did not believe it. On this side, two inspectors found the scene of an illegal surgery. They immediately called Professor Deok to help with the search. It turns out that Professor Deok was not surprised at all that he did not win the award. Because that night, Mrs. Ichida revealed to him about Seok's offer. She wanted to agree, but hesitated because she did not completely trust Seok's ability. Unexpectedly, Professor Deok stood up to guarantee for Seok, hoping that she would give Seok a chance. At night, Seok made an appointment to meet Professor Deok to provoke him and even brag about her achievements. After listening to Seok's boasting, he immediately praised her for being very good, but still inferior to him. When he was young, Seok asked about the disappearance of Professor Moon-jin. Not allowing Professor Deok to explain, Seok asked him directly if he had killed Moon-jin. Seok ironic Professor Deok for not letting her go to of Boston to punish her just because she had saved the life of a patient he wanted to kill. After listening to Seok talk for a while, Professor Deok just said that she was pitiful and then got in the car and left. Immediately after, Professor Deok and 2 inspectors went to the temple where Seok had performed surgery on the mafia boss. There are many police and police dogs searching the place. Inspector Dong-young reveals that the one who informed the police is Chairman Min Sik. He also said that this is brain surgery. That's why Inspector Dong-young asked Professor Deok. When they arrived at the operating room, Professor Deok imagined Seok's figure. He tried to distract Inspector Dong-young. There is no electricity here, so even someone with excellent medical skills cannot perform surgery. Suddenly, his subordinates called Inspector Dong-young out. The police dog discovered a corpse buried nearby. It is not strange that corpse is the unfortunate nurse Mi-ran that Seok killed. Back in the past, before the incident with Professor Moon-jin happened, one day, Seok suddenly called to ask for leave. Professor Deok was very surprised because there was an important surgery today. Normally, she would definitely not miss it. He went to the dormitory but couldn't find Seok. Young said that yesterday, she said she was going home to get some winter clothes. Professor Deok immediately asked Young to take him to Seok's house. Seok opened the door with a bruised face as if she had been beaten. Professor Deok immediately noticed a pile of books in front of the warehouse door. Young said that this was the house that an old lady close to him rented to Seok at a cheap price. Young asked what happened to Seok's face, but she only answered vaguely and invited the 2 of them to have coffee. The professor immediately asked Young to buy medicine for Seok so he could talk to her privately. He asked her directly why she asked for leave. He said that the 2 of them looked very similar, so she didn't have to beat around the bush. Seok was still confused and lied that she slipped and fell yesterday. Seeing that he didn't seem to believe her, she made an excuse to go to the bathroom. Then Seok called Young to urge her to come back and take the professor away immediately. Young saw that she was angry and had no choice but to comply. Seok went out and didn't see the professor. Seok panicked and ran to the warehouse, but it was too late. The professor had discovered the body she had hidden there. Seok still denied it to the end. She said she didn't know who this person was and why he was here. But then Seok tearfully told the truth. Yesterday, when she was walking home from the fat bus stop, she had just opened the door when he attacked her from behind. She bit the rapist's hand, pulled out a knife, and stabbed him in the neck. Professor Deok calmly said that she was only defending herself. He asked her how she planned to dispose of the body now. She replied that she would bury it in the woods at night. He asked her if she could handle it herself. Professor Deok only asked that and left immediately, as if it was no big deal. Seok was shocked for a moment before understanding, so she quickly chased after Deok and said she would see him tomorrow. Back to the present, after discovering the body of Nurse Mi-ran, the police immediately conducted a large-scale search around the temple to collect more evidence. Seok was not only not afraid, but also went to see the scene herself. Youngju, who was with her, was shaking but could not do anything. Youngju also discovered that Seok's nostrils were flaring as if she was holding back laughter. She was very confident that she had erased all traces. At this moment, Seok saw Professor Deok, so her face immediately changed color. In the pit of burned supplies, Inspector Dong-young discovered a bottle of mannitol. Its function is to remove excess water in the body and can be used in brain surgery. The police spread out everywhere to search, and they discovered Mi-ran's bag. At this time, Young brought the computer to Professor Deok. The 2 turned around and saw Seok playing with the police dog. It turned out that Seok claimed to be Professor Deok's student and came here to help. She also bragged to Inspector Lee Kwan that she raised several Rottweilers, so she was close to dogs. Professor Deok was angry and pulled her aside to talk. He told her not to appear here, but Seok thought he wanted to take revenge on her for the Ichida Award or threatened to force her to perform surgery for him. The professor was so angry that he called Seok a poor idiot who went around killing people. Seok said that he also killed Professor Moon-jin, so the 2 of them were the same. Seok also threatened Professor Deok that when she found Professor Moon-jin's body, she would inform him. When Seok passed Inspector Dong-young, he immediately recognized her as the one who caused trouble for Professor Deok. Youngju tried to dissuade Seo, but she still insisted that Professor Moon-jin was killed by Professor Deok. Today, she made an appointment to meet his son to investigate together. Youngju angrily said he wouldn't go, but stay here to pray for her to wake up soon. Ki-young reveals that someone said he saw his father in a mental hospital. The problem is that this hospital is now closed due to rumors that this place beats patients. While talking, Seok discovers that Ki-young's hands have many scars as if he wants to do something stupid. Meanwhile, Inspector Lee Kwan announces that the forensics discovered animal hair on Nurse Mi-ran's sweater. The specific results will have to wait for the lab to announce. Seok and Ki-young go to the closed mental hospital. It turns out that the person who informed Ki-young used to work as a security guard at this hospital. At that time, this person saw Ki-young's missing person ad and sent him an email. It is unclear why Ki-young only came now. He is certain that the person in the photo was in isolation room 401 with the name Sulk-gu. The problem is that it is very difficult to verify whether the person he saw was really believed Professor Moon-jin or not. After the hospital closed, no one knew where the patients went, but this person said that Seok-gu had a scar on his head from some kind of surgery. This person accidentally saw it when he was getting a haircut. Looking at the person's drawing, it was indeed a scar from brain surgery. The two of them immediately asked to go to the hospital to check. While waiting for this person to find the key, Ki-young seemed strangely emotional, so he had to make an excuse to go to the bathroom to calm down. When Seok asked if anyone had visited Seok-gu, the guard said that a gray-haired man came to visit and pushed a wheelchair around. Seok happily took out a picture of Professor Daeok, but he could not confirm it. Meanwhile, Professor Daeok already knew that Seok went to see Ki-young because he had sent his assistant Na-hee to follow Seok. Na-hee commented that Professor and Seok were very similar, but he affirmed that the nature of the two people was still very different. Seok reads Seok-gu's medical records and discovers that the hospital gave him a lot of medicine for no reason. The security guard still has no way to prove that Seok-gu is Professor Moon-jin. Ki-young gets mad because he thinks this person wants to scam to get the reward money. This person remembers that a reporter came here to take pictures of the patients, so he immediately calls a colleague to ask for that picture. But the other person said that he was hiking and would send it when he got home, so the two of them have to wait again. Seok worries and shows him the picture of Dr. Daeok again, but he can't remember. Assistant Na-hee makes an appointment to meet the forensic doctor to chat. She also inquires about the hair found on the victim's shirt that belongs to a Rottweiler. They will notify the police tomorrow afternoon. After listening to Na-hee's report, Professor Daeok tells her to handle it well, so as not to leave any consequences. He sits and thinks back to the past. At that time, Seok often worked so hard that she lacked sleep. Young said she was addicted to drugs, but Professor Daeok knew that what she was addicted to was not drugs, but surgeries. The mystery of the brain and nervous system was so strangely attractive to Seok that she found sleeping and eating to be just time-wasting hassles, so the professor asked her to eat, drink, and sleep properly, and confiscated her concentration-enhancing medicine. Seok also understood that the professor was very worried about her. Back in the present, Ki-young and Seok were waiting to see the photo, but the other person did not answer the phone, so the guard asked the two to come back tomorrow. He would go to the other person's house tomorrow morning to get the photo. Young suddenly went crazy and demanded to see the photo right now. Young argued and pushed the guard down. Seok quickly rushed in to stop him and told Young to go outside and calm down. Seeing the guard cut his hand with a piece of glass, Seok tried to take care of his wound. Unexpectedly, Seok just cut off the glove and saw Professor Moon-jin's ring. At this time, he confessed that he had robbed Moon-jin and it was stuck, so he couldn't take it off. Just then, Ki-young turned around and heard something about the ring, so he rushed in to see it. The guard panicked and ran away, but was still knocked down by Ki-young. Ki-young saw the ring and immediately suspected that the guard had murdered his father, so he went crazy and strangled the guard. Seok rushed out to stop him, but it was too late. The other two struggled and then pulled each other down the cliff. Seok could only hold her head in frustration. The guard was dead and Ki-young was seriously injured and was lying in the emergency room. Seok was helpless because all the clues had been cut off, leaving only Professor Moon-jin's ring. Seok went straight to the hospital, went into Professor Daeok's room, threw the ring on the table, and loudly asked if he was the one who killed Professor Moon-jin. Right, if he had really wanted to kill Professor Moon-jin, she would have done it. Seok thought Professor Daeok was a hypocrite. He was embarrassed by her and chased her away. Professor Daeok didn't say anything but just left quietly. On the way, he deliberately drove faster than the speed limit so that the camera could capture it. As soon as he got home, he told the maid to cook porridge for him, then could go home early. The maid brought the porridge to his room. Seeing that the professor was taking a bath, the maid put it down and got in the car and left. In fact, Professor Daeok had already left the house secretly. He went to a remote house in the middle of the forest where he kept a white car. That car was Professor Moon-jin's car. Professor Daeok recalled that day when Professor Moon-jin opened the car door, something stuck to his hand. Seeing that, Professor Daeok immediately gave Moon-jin a wet towel to wipe his hand. Moon-jin wiped it and then brought it to his nose to smell. Back to the present, Professor Daeok drove a white car to meet Inspector Lee Kwon. The scenario was exactly the same as last time. He opened the car door and got something in his hand. Then Professor Daeok gave Lee Kwon a wet towel. Lee Kwon wiped it off and then brought it up to his nose to smell. It turned out that Professor Daeok had an appointment to meet Lee Kwon to talk about Inspector Dong-young. Lee Kwon knew that the hair stuck on the victim's shirt was from a Rottweiler. Coincidentally, Seok also raised them. It was not common for a brain surgeon to raise a Rottweiler. Speaking of this, Lee Kwon suddenly felt sleepy. Soon, only Professor Daeok was left in the car. He put on gloves and pressed the music button to relax. That year it was Professor Daeok who put a knife to his neck and forced Professor Moon-jin to make the last call to his son. As soon as Moon-jin hung up, Professor Daeok immediately stabbed him in the neck. Professor Daeok then gave him a towel to stop the bleeding. Moon-jin took the towel and opened the car door while staggering to escape, but was cornered by Professor Daeok and fell down the cliff. Professor Daeok was sure that Moon-jin was dead, so he left. Unexpectedly, Moon-jin was still alive. It turned out that the the person who saved Moonjin was Na-hee. That year, Professor Deok-hee asked her to buy a piece of land on the mountain. When she found a few pieces, he chose a piece of land full of stray dogs, and the owner was also fed up. She was curious, so she followed and witnessed Professor Deok-hee attacking Moonjin. She did not dare to call the police, but still tried to save Moonjin. After escaping death, Moonjin suffered severe brain damage to the point that he could not remember his own name. Na-hee took him to a mental hospital under a fake name. He passed away 3 months ago in a nursing home. After confirming that Moonjin was truly dead, Professor Deok-hee returned to the cliff and threw his ring down. Deok-hee suddenly remembered that Seok once said that the two of them were very similar, like two sides of a coin. He always denied it, but maybe she was right. Since all the clues had been cut off, Seok was upset and went hunting wild boars for 2 days and 2 nights without eating or sleeping. Youngju worriedly advised her to rest. If anything happened, she should tell him everything. Unexpectedly, Seok got angry and chased him away. Only the poor wild boars were vented on their heads by her. When Professor Deok-hee came to the hospital to visit Ki-young, the doctor said that his condition was not very good. Deok-hee just went out the door and met Seok. Seok asked Deok-hee if she intended to let Ki-young die like his father. Deok-hee said that he was like that because he got involved in other people's business. Deok-hee also revealed that the police found dog hair on the nurse's clothes. Seok said that she would not report Professor Moonjin to the police. Seok also acknowledged that Professor Deok-hee was a great teacher, but she still refused to operate on him. For her, the old grudge cannot be easily forgotten. Inspector Dong-young is having a headache over the illegal surgery case. Furthermore, Inspector Lee Kwan has disappeared without a trace. Dong-young orders all the security footage from that night to be collected to find out where Lee Kwan went after leaving the police station. The new soldier suspects that Chairman Min-sik is involved because Inspector Lee Kwan mentioned Min-sik before he disappeared. When checking Lee Kwan's call log, Inspector Dong-young discovers that the last person he called was Professor Deok-hee. Inspector Song secretly reports the case to the underworld, the subordinate of the boss that Seok operated on. He also accuses Chairman Min-sik of being the one who informed the police. His reward is a thick envelope. Inspector Dong-young meets Professor Deok-hee and asks him about the phone call with Inspector Lee Kwan that night. The professor says that the two of them planned to meet, but in the end he couldn't come because he wasn't feeling well. Professor Deok-hee says that the reason they met was because Inspector Lee Kwan wanted to reveal that Inspector Dong-young had accepted a bribe. Of course, Inspector Dong-young doesn't believe the professor's statement and says he will check it out again. In fact, Inspector Dong-young sent his subordinates to Professor Deok-hee's house to investigate, but the professor had calculated everything before taking action, so they couldn't find any clues. Youngju goes to Mari's restaurant to have dinner alone. Mari seems very relieved after getting rid of her thug brother. She asks why Seok hasn't come. That's what worries Youngju, because Seok hasn't been eating for the past few days. At this time, Seok is at home thinking about Professor Deok-hee's words. Dr. Hyunho stopped by to see how Seok was doing because Youngju was so worried about her. They hadn't gotten any surgeries lately. Seok just wished she was locked up in a prison where she would do surgeries all day, just eating, sleeping, and doing surgeries like that. Even if she got a life sentence, it would be fine. Hyunho said that he and Youngju would follow her, but he would follow as a doctor. Youngju would only follow because of Seok. Youngju would be unconditionally loyal to her. Youngju really cared about her. Seok remembered that the first time she met Youngju, it was Hyunho who introduced her. At that time, Youngju had a malignant brain tumor, but he didn't want to have surgery, even though Seok was willing to do it for free. She could tell right away that he was afraid of surgery and just wanted to go peacefully, but he couldn't go peacefully because as the tumor grew bigger, he would have splitting headaches, not to mention vomiting every day. It would be a slow and painful death. If he died during surgery, it would only be a second, but he slept and didn't wake up. He wanted to die peacefully, so this was better. Youngju agreed to let Seok operate on him after hearing that. Of course, the surgery was successful, so Youngju lived until today. Seok made Youngju sing a song to thank her, but his face looked like he had lost his soul. Back to the present, Youngju was cleaning the pharmacy when the gangsters came. Seeing their attitude, it wasn't a good thing. The next day, Seok found out that Youngju was not at home. She called him and he said he was at school. Seok went to school to look for him, but couldn't find him. She called and asked, but Youngju said he was going to the movies with his friends. In fact, he had been captured and tortured by gangsters. The gangster asked Youngju if he or his boss had killed the nurse. At first, Youngju refused to confess, but when he threatened to arrest Seok for questioning, Youngju decided to take the blame for her. On the other side, after receiving Min-sik's phone number from a secret source, Inspector Dong-young immediately called him to make an appointment. Min-sik had just talked to Inspector Song when he called Professor Deok-hee. Min-sik threatened to reveal Seok's illegal surgery. The professor panicked and called Inspector Dong-young and made an appointment to meet him right away, but the inspector refused because he had an appointment with someone else. It seemed that he had begun to suspect Professor Deok-hee. That night, Min-sik led his subordinates to see Professor Deok-hee. He planned to let Min-sik hide in this luxurious apartment. Min-sik already knew that Hyunho and Seok were were doing illegal surgery but had not yet reported it to the police. Min-sik wanted to wait and see which side would offer more attractive conditions. When Min-sik asked Professor Deok-hee if he had done anything to Seok, he became angry. At that moment, Professor Deok-hee just wanted to slash Min-sik's neck immediately, but that was just Deok-hee's imagination. Min-sik had made an appointment to meet Inspector Dong-young, but he did not come to the meeting place. When Inspector Dong-young called, Min-sik answered the phone and only talked vaguely to Inspector Dong-young. Min-sik's purpose was to put pressure on Professor Deok-hee. As soon as the professor left, Min-sik immediately called to tell the Korean guests the good news. The client was a gangster who requested the best surgeon in Korea. On the other side, Seok searched for Youngju at the cinema, but couldn't find him. At that moment, he called, or more precisely, the gangsters used his phone to call her. When Seok arrived at their hideout, she found Youngju beaten up. The boss didn't beat around the bush and asked straight about the nurse Miran case. He asked Seok if the police investigated, they would find him and his gang. He wanted to know what he had to do, and he was sure that nurse Miran was killed by Seok herself. Seok didn't deny it and assured him that she would settle everything and not implicate him. Right after that, the boss showed Seok a picture of Min-sik. He made her make sure that this guy wouldn't say a word to the police again. On the way home, Seok suddenly stopped the car and asked Youngju if he wanted to move to the Philippines with her. Seok wanted to open a pharmacy there because she was sick of living there, but Youngju replied that he couldn't just leave. Suddenly, the fire truck roared in, heading straight for Seok's house. Seeing that, she panicked and ran back to see a huge fire in the warehouse, which was where she raised her 3 pet dogs. Seok was in great pain when she saw that the warehouse had been completely burned down. The culprit of the fire was Assistant Na-hee. The person who gave the order was none other than Professor Deok-hee. The purpose was to destroy the evidence of Seok's murder. Seok called the professor and demanded to meet him right now. She drove to the meeting point and crashed straight into the back of his car. Not satisfied with her anger, she backed up and crashed again. This time, Professor Deok-hee got out of the car. He calmly took out a cigarette to smoke as if challenging Say. She angrily stepped on the gas and drove straight at him, but at the last minute she still turned the wheel to the side and drove away. For a lonely person like Seok, losing 3 pet dogs was no different from losing her children and closest friends. She looked at the burnt collars and cried with heartache. At this moment, Min-sik suddenly came to find her. It turned out that they were old acquaintances. Min-sik had hired Hyun-ho and Seok to do surgery before, but the two of them flatly refused when they knew that his purpose was organ trafficking. After a while of provocative conversation, he took out a patient file of a brain tumor that needed surgery. Seeing Seok refuse, he turned to ask Hyun-ho. He asked how Dr. Hyun-ho could work with someone like her. Seok went crazy when she heard that and wanted to strangle him to death immediately. Then Min-sik reminded him that she still owed him 120 million won in principal and interest. At this point, she could no longer refuse. Seok's group was taken to an extremely luxurious ship by the gang. The patient must be a very rich and powerful person. It was said that this case would require 2 surgeons, and at this moment, the second surgeon appeared. This person got out of the car and walked towards Seok. It was none other than Professor Deok-hee. Seok glared at him, as if she wanted to eat him alive. Back in time, when Professor Deok-hee had just returned to the country, the head of the department often told him about the troublesome student Seok. The orphan girl came to the entrance ceremony, but only carried a backpack and was accompanied by a social worker. However, Professor Deok-hee felt sympathy because he was also a poor student. The head of the department said that Seok had mental problems. He said that she took advantage of her top academic performance to demand all kinds of scholarships and subsidies. One time, gangsters broke into Seok's classroom to demand money. Turned out that she had run out of money and had borrowed money from a loan shark. The teacher told Seok that if she needed money, she should work part-time, but she said that her time was only for studying. The head of the department gave Professor Deok-hee Seok's residency application form and told Deok-hee to read it and she would know why he hated Seok. Professor Deok-hee still kept the form carefully until now. Sometimes he even took it out to read again. Back in the present, Seok was extremely angry with Min-sik because he chose Professor Deok-hee to perform surgery with her. He explained that the patient requested the best doctor in Korea and Professor Deok-hee would be the chief surgeon. As for her, she kept quiet. Youngju couldn't help but be surprised when she saw the operating room with high-end equipment that was no different from a hospital. He was only worried that Seok wouldn't be the main surgeon. He was afraid that she would get mad at Professor Deok-hee during the surgery. At this time, the ship carrying the surgical team had set sail. On the deck, Seok, with tears in her eyes, threw 3 dog collars into the sea. At this moment, Professor Deok-hee arrived. Seok asked why he burned her dogs alive. He calmly replied that it was just a few dogs. Seok immediately went crazy when she heard the professor say that. She used an umbrella to hit him repeatedly as if she wanted to avenge her dogs. Luckily, Youngju and Hyun-ho came to stop them. Otherwise, who knows what would have happened to Professor Deok-hee. Seok returned to her room but still couldn't calm down. Youngju stood outside and begged, but it was useless. Min-sik knew what happened and immediately reminded him to control Seok. If she ruined the surgery, no one would be able to leave this ship alive. Professor Daoki wondered why Hyunho could work with Seoke when she had serious psychological problems. Hyunho told him not to bully Seoke anymore. Hyunho found a good doctor to perform brain surgery on Professor Daoki, but he insisted that Seoke only operate on him because she was the best. At this time, Enan Kim had returned to the country. Assistant Nahi picked him up at the airport and took him to Professor Daoki's villa. Enan Kim wanted to talk to the professor, but she said he was in a place where he couldn't answer the phone. The next morning, Min Sik took Professor to see the patient. It was In-tae, the leader of a cult. He told Professor Daoki to save his life. Un-tae was sick but didn't dare go to the hospital because he had told his followers that he was immortal, yet he shamelessly told Professor Daoki to have faith. Un-tae also invited Daoki to join the cult. On this side, Youngju bought bread for Seoke, but she didn't want to eat it. Hyunho mentioned Professor Daoki, which made her even more upset. Furthermore, Min Sik comes to provoke her about beating her teacher last night. Seoke wonders why she did the surgery at night to be tired. He explains that it was because the patient requested it. Un-tae wanted to feel like he was sleeping during the surgery. Only then did Hyunho reveal that the patient was Un-tae. Seoke immediately showed her disgust upon hearing that. Un-tae's sector has more than 200,000 followers. That's why he has the money to rent the whole ship to perform surgery like this. Youngju is afraid that if he makes a mistake while assisting in the surgery for the first time, they will kill him. Seoke says that Professor Daoki's hands are shaking so much that she asks Hyunho to keep an eye on him. Hyunho then asks why he still hasn't reported it when it's so serious. Seoke says that the professor has a very high ego. Meanwhile, the entire investigation team is being scolded by their boss because their colleague has been missing for 2 weeks without finding any clues. Min Sik is also missing. Inspector Dong Young only asked for 1 more week to investigate. The whole team immediately went to arrest the smuggling boss. He was the one who gave Min Sik his phone number. On the ship, Professor Daoki took out the last bottle of painkiller and injected it into his arm. This was the only way he could perform the surgery. Finally, it was time for the surgery. Un-tae was taken to the operating room. Seoke was waiting there. Min Sik introduced Seoke as Professor Daoki's best student. Un-tae criticized her for being too young, just a child. Seoke immediately sarcastically said that he was too old and afraid he wouldn't be able to bear the surgery. He immediately asked her to explain what she was going to do in her head. Of course, this didn't make Seok difficult. She explained that his tumor was in a very difficult position, so Daoki would transport it from above and she would do an endoscopy through the sinus. The two of them worked together to remove it from both sides. Seoke was still worried that Professor Daoki's hands were shaking, so she reminded him to change places if there was any problem during the surgery, but he firmly refused. While Seoke was removing the tumor, he ordered more. She stubbornly objected, but he was so stubborn that she had to obey in the end. Meanwhile, Inspector Dong Young was interrogating the smuggling boss. It turned out that he had planned to take Min Sik to China, but it happened to be a day when there was a patrol, so it failed. Inspector Dong Young had promised to spare this guy if he gave Min Sik's phone number, but now it was urgent, so he was willing to break his promise. The other guy had to call Min Sik. When he heard Inspector Dong Young's voice, Min Sik tried to hang up, but he threatened to put Min Sik in jail for murdering Inspector Lee Kwan. On this side, while removing the tumor, Professor Daoki's hands shook, causing the patient to bleed. Seoke worriedly asked if she needed to change seats, but he just closed his eyes to rest for a moment and then continued. Youngju was still confused when she first assisted in a surgery, which made Seoke so angry that she got angry. The professor immediately turned to her and asked if she was focused. He said she was too arrogant and no one liked her. He also said that Seoke was impulsive and ungrateful. Although Seoke did not grateful to him, Professor Daoki was extremely grateful to her. Thanks to her, he found teaching interesting. Hearing his teacher's sincere words for the first time moved Seoke. In the end, the surgery was completed successfully. Professor Daoki breathed a sigh of relief. Seoke thought absent-mindedly for a while and then ran to find him, but she was still shy and did not say anything, telling him to say whatever he wanted to say. Obviously, the two of them did not like each other, but he insisted that he did not hate her. Seoke said that the time she felt happiest was when she was working with him, but now, remembering those days is like torture for her. But after all, she still wants to send her thanks to the professor. Seoke thanks him for everything. On this side, Young thought that Professor Daoki was sick, so he came to visit. Young met Enan Kim at Professor Daoki's house. He mentioned that he was about to cooperate with Seoke in an extremely difficult surgery. Young looked at the x-ray and realized that the professor's illness was too serious. As usual, Hyunho would stay to monitor the patient. Seoke seemed disappointed when she knew that Professor Daoki had left first. But the professor did not go straight home but told Nahi to stop by the pier, and he took out Seoke's residency application from years ago to read again. Seoke expressed to the head of the department, who had disliked her for a long time, her determination to become a neurosurgeon at all costs. Ever since she was little, her mind has always been in chaos, like there were explosions in her head. It made her unable to sleep at night or concentrate on anything. Seoke thought that there was a worm crawling inside her brain, making her think non-stop. She once thought of cutting her brain open to get that worm, but from the first time she entered the operating room and witnessed the human brain, she saw where she truly belonged. That was why she had to register for the neurosurgery residency program. Now she understood why Professor Daoki hold this student Seoke dear and this application so much, because Seoke's story was exactly like his own life. On this side, Min-sik invited Seoke and Youngju to celebrate the victory, but in fact he had a plot in mind. Yesterday, he was threatened by Inspector Dong-young, so he planned to hand Seoke over in exchange. But Seoke was not stupid. She used the excuse of a headache to ask Youngju to buy medicine, but her eyes followed Min-sik closely. Min-sik intended to lure Seoke to the meeting point to hand her over to Inspector Dong-young. Unexpectedly, Min-sik returned and did not see her. While he was looking for her, she suddenly appeared. She told him to go somewhere so they could talk privately. At this moment, Young called to ask where the professor was. Young revealed to Seoke that the professor's illness was very serious and he needed to go to the hospital immediately. At this time, Inspector Dong-young saw Min-sik and Seoke's figures from afar. Suddenly, Seoke turned around. She caught a glimpse of someone like Professor Daoki dragging Min-sik away. At this time, Youngju also turned back and saw blood on the ground and the police approaching. Youngju panicked and pulled Seoke to escape. When they just arrived at a small alley, Seoke received a text message from a strange number to meet at the red lighthouse. When the two arrived at the meeting point, Youngju discovered Min-sik's car key. The two of them went to look for the car and found a bunch of fake license plates in the trunk. Seoke called Young back to ask about Professor Daoki's condition. Young said he had seen Professor Daoki's MRI and they couldn't operate on Daoki anymore. But Seoke was sure she could operate. She wanted Young to send her the MRI. Inspector Dong-young chased after her but found no one and only blood dripping on the ground. Not long after, the police discovered Min-sik, but he was only a corpse. The professor called Eun Kim to thank him for the painkillers he sent, but unfortunately, it was still a bit too little. The professor promised to come back tomorrow and meet him to discuss the surgery. That night, Seoke couldn't sleep but anxiously waited for Young to send the MRI. Youngju was very worried about him when Seoke confirmed that Professor Daoki had killed Min-sik. Youngju didn't know if he had disposed of the body yet. Youngju said that it was thanks to him that they weren't caught by the police. Seoke angrily scolded Youngju. After waiting for a long time, Young finally sent Professor Daoki's MRI scan. It was clear that his illness was worse than the CT scan he gave Hyunho. Professor Daoki lied to Seoke again. He was so sick, and yet he killed someone for her. Youngju kept asking while Seoke was having a headache. At the morgue, the forensic doctor concluded that the murder weapon that killed Min-sik was a thin and sharp object about 1 centimeter wide. The special thing was that the murderer had stabbed the spleen between the ribs. It was possible that the murderer intentionally caused internal bleeding and controlled the bleeding to a certain extent, just enough so that the victim wouldn't faint on the spot and could be helped away from the scene. The external wound was very small, so the blood didn't flow out too much, but accumulated inside the abdominal cavity. So when they left, they didn't attract anyone's attention. If her guess was correct, then the murderer must have some medical knowledge. He could be a doctor, for example. Her impression when examining the body was that the murderer did it very neatly. The police checked the security cameras but only saw the back of the murderer. Everyone guessed that it was the illegal surgeon that Min-sik intended to hand over. He must have had a criminal record because he was so skilled. Inspector Dong-young was annoyed because Inspector Song was from another team but kept coming to his team to gossip. Actually, Inspector Dong-young already knew who the murderer was because at that time he had caught a glimpse of Professor Daoki leading Min-sik into a small alley. It was ironic to discover that his longtime friend was the murderer. Inspector Song revealed all the information he had just heard to the mafia boss. The boss was a bit surprised when he knew that the person who killed Min-sik was a man, not a woman. As soon as he hung up, the boss focused on watching the video of the miraculous surgery that Seoke performed to save his life. A few days later, Hyunho returned. As soon as Hyunho opened the door to the clinic, he saw Seoke and Youngju waiting. Looking at his bandaged hand, Seoke curiously opened it to see a bite mark. This bite mark was from a human bite. Seoke guessed that Yoontae must have bitten Hyunho. She even asked to find Yoontae's address to bite him back. Youngju laughed, making Seoke remember Professor Daoki. Seoke asked Hyunho to find her an operating room to operate on him. Seoke said that regardless of whether it was worth it or not, she had to do it. After watching the MRI, Hyunho admitted that the professor's condition was more serious than he had imagined. Seoke said that the professor's tumor surrounded the cerebral artery, so the entire artery would probably have to be removed and a blood vessel grafted in place. Seoke had performed a similar surgery late last year, and the patient almost died from blood loss. But that was her first time doing a vascular graft. So this time, Seoke was confident that she could do it. Hyunho also supported her and said that he would find an operating room. Professor Daoki introduced Eun Kim to the chairman and doctors at the hospital. The young doctors were excited because the professor had invited a famous doctor from America. It turned out that he was invited here to collaborate on research on cerebral artery graft surgery. This was one of the most complex and sophisticated neurosurgeries, so the risks were extremely high. Eun Kim was just eager to meet Seoke. Watching Seoke's surgery video reminded him of a friend. That friend was also always decisive in the operating room, like a high-performance machine. But outside the operating room, he was a jerk. He was very good at turning new acquaintances into enemies. A genius who knows he's a genius is the most hateful type of person, right? Everyone avoids him, but In Kim likes to be friends with people like that because being close to them will help him achieve more. But that friend has passed away. In Kim asks when she will see Seo-K again. Professor Deo-ki just smiles mysteriously. Youngju tells Seo-K not to operate on Professor Deo-ki anymore because the risk is too high, but she is determined not to make a mistake. At this moment, the gangster invites her to meet the boss. The two are taken to a villa where the gang is having lunch. Seo-K calmly goes in to eat with the boss, while Youngju is blocked outside. He says that the police have not found any evidence of Min-sik's case, but they have determined that the culprit is a man. The boss is curious about who did it, but Seo-K doesn't say anything. Anyway, after watching his brain surgery video, he finds it miraculous and is even more grateful to Seo-K. So if she needs help with anything, just tell him. On this side, Inspector Dong-young asked Professor Deo-ki to have dinner together. The professor asked what happened, but he didn't say anything and just kept drinking. Seeing that, the professor said, if there was anything, just say it. Inspector Dong-young speculated that Professor was the one who killed the nurse and police officer Lee Kwan, and that he was also involved in Min-sik's death. Unexpectedly, Professor Deo-ki smiled mysteriously and said that he also knew about the inspector. Deo-ki asked if Dong-young could abandon his family and go to jail. Hearing that, Inspector Dong-young was extremely confused. On this side, Ki-young, the son of Professor Moon-jin, had passed away. Deo-ki went to pay her respects, but was provoked by Seo, and she said that the person who killed Ki-young's father had also arrived. She then followed the professor to ask him why he killed Moon-jin. Professor Deo-ki had no choice but to tell the truth. At that time, Professor Moon-jin had noticed Seo-K and wanted to invite her to his hospital in Los Angeles. The chairman had nominated a few people and he chose her. Seo-K laughed and asked the professor if he thought she would follow Moon-jin. Deo-ki also revealed that Professor Moon-jin was actually a businessman, not a doctor. He forced young doctors to do a bunch of surgeries and then enjoyed the money himself. Professor Deo-ki did not agree to let someone like him take away the student he had trained. After hearing that, Seo-K immediately agreed with Professor Deo-ki. If it were Seo-K, she would also kill him. The student who always opposed him agreed with him today, making Professor Deo-ki extremely confused. At this time, it was raining heavily, making the two teachers and students remember that day. The day Seo-K was kicked out of the hospital by Professor Deo-ki. She knelt in the rain to beg for forgiveness, but he just coldly passed by. Seo-K wanted to know why the professor treated her like that. Deo-ki just sighed and said nothing. She thought that Inspector Dong-young would be extremely worried because of Professor Deo-ki's threats, but he was surprisingly confident. Inspector Dong-young muttered that Professor Deo-ki was dead for sure, and he was not. Immediately after, his subordinate reported that there was an improved surveillance video. When he looked closely at the video, he found that Seo-K was also standing there. Deo-ki took Seo-K to the old operating room of the hospital and told her to ask whatever she wanted. Seo-K continued to ask about the reason why he was avoiding her. Was it because she found out about his intention to kill Professor Moon-jin that he felt hurt? Professor Deo-ki immediately replied that he should not sit down and tell her that was what a teacher should do. Was it because she was happy to know that her teacher was a murderer? It was unusual, but that was Seo-K's true feeling. She didn't want him to die. Seo-K told Professor Deo-ki to let her operate on him, but he thought she wanted to operate on him because she felt sorry for him. Seo-K was so angry that she shouted to kill him right now, but she had to go find an operating room for him. Before leaving, Seo-K told Professor Deo-ki that it was best to wait here for her, because if he wandered off and died, she wouldn't be responsible. After saying that, Seo-K left. Professor Deo-ki was scolded like that, but was so touched that she couldn't speak. Deo-ki informed In Kim that they would tell the hospital that he and Woo-young were the two surgeons, but in reality, it would be him and Seo-K. At this time, Seo-K was researching cerebral artery bypass surgery techniques. Youngju started asking all sorts of questions. He asked if she had many teachers who loved her when she was in school, but she didn't think so, because she often pointed out their mistakes. She also took this opportunity to ask why Youngju agreed to follow her like this. Youngju stammered that it was probably because he didn't understand her, so he followed her. He hoped that one day he would understand what she did. He and Ho found a secret operating room for Professor Deo-ki. It was an operating room of a private hospital. Because it hadn't been used for a long time, it had become a warehouse. They would only be able to use this operating room from 10 o'clock at night to 6 o'clock the next morning. Seo-K thought the place was fine and wanted to pay him, but he didn't take it. He said he was only doing this for Dr. Han-ho. Meanwhile, Na-hee suddenly came and gave Youngju a business card. Seo-K received a call from Inspector Dong-young, inviting her to cooperate in the investigation. In the interrogation room, he asked Seo-K if she must hate Deo-ki a lot, right? This question reminded Seo-K of the first time she met Professor Deo-ki. In the pouring rain, she begged Professor Deo-ki to pass on everything he had to her. She would do her best to become an excellent doctor like him. Professor Deo-ki calmly asked her how she would repay him. Unexpectedly, Silk answered without thinking that she would not repay him anything, but would only absorb all the knowledge. After listening, the professor did not say anything, but just laughed out loud. While Seo-K was lost in her memories, Inspector Dong-young suddenly spoke up and said that Seo-K was Deo-ki's weak point. moment. It was clear that Professor Deok-hee had no reason to do illegal surgery. The person Min-sik wanted to confess was Seok. Seok was also the reason Deok-hee killed Min-sik. Seok clearly did not believe what he said because she and Professor Deok-hee did not like each other. But Inspector Dong-young was different. He affirmed that he had known Deok-hee all his life. Deok-hee had never tolerated anyone before, but Seok was the complete opposite. It could be seen that Seok was Professor Deok-hee's weak point. Inspector Dong-young also clearly saw that Professor Deok-hee was the real crazy one. On this side, before the life and death surgery, Professor Deok-hee cleaned his office and generously gave Na-hee a thick envelope. Seok called to inform that she had found an operating room. She told him to fast from tomorrow afternoon to prepare for the surgery. She planned to pick him up tomorrow night, but he told her to send him the address so he could come himself. Na-hee asked why he had not told Seok yet. By then, she would be angry and hurt. Knowing that the professor was planning this, Na-hee would not have helped him. Then, Na-hee said that Inspector Dong-young came to question Seok this morning. Hearing that, Professor Deok-hee was extremely upset. The next night, Hyun-ho and Seok were ready for the surgery. They were just waiting for Professor Deok-hee to arrive. But at this time, Professor Deok-hee called Inspector Dong-young to meet him at a remote warehouse in the forest. Inspector Dong-young immediately set off without hesitation. When he saw the warehouse, he walked over without any suspicion and opened the door. Seeing a large refrigerator in front of him, he opened it without hesitation. Surprisingly, inside was the frozen body of police officer Lee Kwan. Seok waited for a long time, but Professor Deok-hee did not appear. After waiting for a long time, someone finally opened the door, but it was not the professor but a stranger. He was Dr. In Kim. At this time, Professor Deok-hee entered the warehouse to confront Inspector Dong-young. Deok-hee plays the recording of police officer Lee Kwan, revealing the crimes of Dong-young. At the scene of a crime, Inspector Lee Kwan saw Inspector Dong-young there beforehand. Inspector Dong-young clearly picked up a lighter, but it was not on the list of evidence. After investigating, he discovered a secret. Inspector Dong-young destroyed evidence in many cases to blackmail the suspects. After listening, Inspector Dong-young laughed and replied that the drugged confession was worthless. But Professor Deok-hee asked the detective agency to investigate, and they confirmed that police officer Lee Kwan's words were true. The professor took all the blame on himself, from collaborating with Min-sik in illegal surgery to killing the nurse at the temple. Professor Deok-hee challenged Inspector Dong-young to investigate and arrest him. On this side, Seok was surprised when In Kim said that Professor Deok-hee would not come. It was obvious that she was the one who did the surgery, so why didn't the professor come? In Kim smiled and took out a bottle of Saralit painkiller that the professor often used. Since he used this medicine, there would be many unexpected situations during the surgery. Then In Kim said something that made Seok furious and wanted to find the professor immediately. Hyun-ho was teaching Youngju more about Saralit that Professor Deok-hee used. It was a painkiller for terminal cancer patients. The more effective it was, the more serious the side effects were. The surgery would be much more difficult because of horror anesthesia. Hyun-ho suddenly remembered that Deok-hee looked too healthy for a terminal cancer patient, and yet he was still having surgery with them on the ship. It must be thanks to this medicine that he was able to hold on. In Kim revealed Professor Deok-hee's plan, Seok, and he would perform surgery on Deok-hee in a month at the operating room of the new building of John Shin University. Hyun-ho was also asked to be in charge of anesthesia. Seok would not be able to find Professor Deok-hee until then because he had already hidden from her. Once she knew that he had used Saralit, Seok would want to operate on him as soon as possible, but the professor did not want that. He wanted his condition to worsen. Could it be that what he wanted was to die on the operating table? Sure enough, when Seok went to Professor Deok-hee's villa, she could not find him. However, she saw the table lamp that he had given her. When she was expelled from the hospital, she had thrown it away in the dormitory, not expecting that he had brought it here. The next day, Inspector Dong-young was called by his subordinates to the warehouse in the forest. It turned out that a woman had called to report case early in the morning. The owner of this house was Professor Deok-hee. The police were searching the house thoroughly, including the cup and cigarette that Professor Deok-hee had used last night. Seok went to Professor Deok-hee's office and saw that it had been cleaned out. Seeing In Kim enter, Seok asked what Professor Deok-hee's purpose was in wanting to die on the operating table. He wanted to die by her hand, right? Turned out to be true. The professor wanted Seok to fail once she realized. Professor Deok-hee told In Kim that she had never failed before, so she had to fail once now. After hearing that, Seok scolded Professor Deok-hee for wanting her to fail. Professor Deok-hee wanted Seok to know that she had to fail once to realize her limits. He was sure that this surgery would fail because he himself would do it. Seok had not failed yet, but was already discouraged with Professor. She asked why In Kim participated, or if he also wanted to fail. In Kim told him to bet that she would succeed. Then, he took her to see the new operating room. The surgery will be done in complete secrecy. Nominally, Dr. Young will be involved, but in reality, she will be the one performing the surgery. But Seok still doesn't understand why Professor Deok-hee is dragging In Kim into this. Seok asks In Kim about the upcoming plan. In Kim says that the scalp veins can't be used because Saralit has weakened the blood vessels. They have to use the saphenous vein. Seok then asks In Kim if she wants to graft graft the leg veins onto the brain veins, but then she thinks that's fine, so she tells In and Kim to just do it. In and Kim is surprised by her extremely calm attitude, because the saphenous vein graft is the first time they've done it, but Seok tells them to just do it, and she'll go get Professor Deok-hee. On the other side, Youngju is having a headache over the business card. That day, Na-hee introduced herself as Professor Deok-hee's friend, and gave it to him. She just said it would be useful. At this time, Professor Deok-hee was leisurely walking in the Han River Park. After a while, he was tired and fell asleep on the chair. At this time, Na-hee came over. The professor immediately confided that he had come to Seoul when he was 17 and had only heard about this place. This was his first time here. Na-hee gave him a phone to use temporarily. Suddenly, Professor Deok-hee had a terrible headache, but he just tried to endure it. Seok went to the boss and asked him to help find Professor Deok-hee, but he told her to sleep for a bit. Na-hee went to see Hyun-ho and told him where Professor Deok-hee was hiding. Hyun-ho found him lying on the sofa. Hyun-ho rushed in to check. It turned out that he was still conscious, but very tired. Hyun-ho immediately gave him an IV to help him stabilize. When he woke up, Hyun-ho advised him to give up surgery because in this condition, Seok could not save him. Why did he have to endure the pain of surgery? Hyun-ho said, "I would take good care of you until he passed away." But Professor Deok-hee refused. He wanted to die on his own terms. Inspector Dong-young held a press conference to announce that the fingerprints and DNA found at the crime scene belonged to Professor Deok-hee and issued a wanted notice. Not only for the murder of police officer Lee Kwan, but also for the murder of the nurse and Min Sik. Seok was shocked and stunned when he heard the bad news on TV. Youngju made an appointment to meet Na-hee to ask where Professor Deok-hee was. Na-hee told Youngju not to worry about him because he wouldn't be caught easily by the police, and now Hyun-ho was probably taking care of him. Na-hee told Youngju not to tell anyone, but he immediately told Seok. Actually, Na-hee had already guessed. The boss called Inspector Song to find Hyun-ho's location using his phone number. Professor Deok-hee took out the last bottle of Ceralip, but his hands were too weak to open it. Hyun-ho saw this and immediately came to help him. The professor confided that he once believed no one would ever lose their life in the operating room. That time, he was so angry that he lost his mind. Luckily, Seok stopped him, but he felt ashamed and humiliated and could not face her anymore. So he chased Seok away, even though she knelt down and cried and begged. A teacher who let such petty pride turn him into a coward. Hyun-ho immediately replied that he felt guilty and should not have let Seok perform the surgery. What if she failed and suffered a psychological trauma? Would she be able to perform the surgery again? Surgeon Seok was at her peak and her self-esteem was high, so the surgery was the most exciting and enjoyable. There was no more satisfying moment than that. For surgeons of the caliber of Professor Deok-hee and Seok, it was very difficult to go further. Seok is now the best like Professor Deok-hee, but he wants her to be better. He can't develop, but Seok has to reach new heights, shedding tears for the patient to overcome her own limits. She has to kill the person she wants to save and go through the moment when she can't hold a scalpel anymore. Professor Deok-hee knew he was at fault with Seok, but even though she didn't want it, he still had to give her everything he could. Seok scolds Youngju because he didn't say he accepted Na-hee's business card. Youngju reminds Na-hee that the professor and Inspector Dong-young had an agreement. The professor took all the blame so that the inspector wouldn't touch Seok. Seok is furious because the teacher arbitrarily took the blame for her. The two of them went to the park as Na-hee said, but they couldn't find the professor anywhere. Inspector Dong-young was scolded by his supervisor for not actively pursuing Professor Deok-hee. He had just gone out when he received a text message from Seok. On this side, the boss found Hyun-ho's location and brought the whole gang there. The boss called to meet Professor Deok-hee. Finally, the professor agreed to meet. Professor Deok-hee asked the boss if Seok told you to come and arrest me. On this side, Inspector Dong-young came to the meeting place to meet Seok. She asked if he had made any agreement with her teacher. Inspector Dong-young replied that professor himself confessed everything. Deok-hee said that he could only live for 1 month. He would contact her before he died. Then Inspector Dong-young closed the case. Hearing that, Seok shouted loudly that her teacher would not die and that she would personally perform surgery on him. Inspector Dong-young saw that and replied that Deok-hee had to die for him to live. This was the agreement between the two of them. Seok could not hold it in any longer and admitted that she had done everything. She warned him not to touch her teacher. It turned out that Seok had recorded the conversation just now as evidence. At this time, Seok received a message from the boss. She immediately set out to find Professor Deok-hee. Suddenly, Seok was hit by Inspector Dong-young driving his car. He dragged Seok out, intending to make her hand unable to do surgery anymore. Seok kicked him away, but was also kicked in the face. Youngju, who had just woken up, rushed out to block Inspector Dong-young. He used his body to take the blow to protect Seok, but Dong-young still pulled him out. Seok immediately pulled out a knife and stabbed him in the leg, then without hesitation, stabbed him straight in the neck. Dong-young died on the spot. On this side, when he heard Professor Deok-hee's confession and explanation, the boss ordered his subordinates to text Seok not to come anymore and to do as the professor said. Professor Deok-hee confided in Hyun-ho again. Seok was his tragic youth. Without asking, he knew that she had lived like him. Seok was strangely similar to him. If the spirit had DNA, then he and Seok were family. On this side, Seoke called the boss and asked him to transfer the phone to Professor Deoki. She lost patience with her teacher. She shouted, "You know Inspector Dong-young, right?" Seoke asked him to come here immediately. Professor Deoki hurriedly drove there. He looked at the scene and immediately knew that Seoke had killed Inspector Dong-young. He saw Youngju covered in blood, sitting on the ground, breathing. He carefully picked up Inspector Dong-young's car key with a towel and put it in his pocket. Deoki opened the trunk and saw his body. Deoki asked why Seo killed the police. He told her to wait, so she had to wait. Seoke angrily replied that he was going to teach her a lesson, but she didn't like it. Seeing the student like that, Professor Deoki still gently asked her how she planned to deal with this body. Seoke calmly replied that he had to help her. Then the two of them laughed horribly. Suddenly, Seoke burst into tears. Deoki told her not to cry. Wait until she performed surgery on him before crying. Didn't she want him to pass on everything? She couldn't stand it and demanded everything. She choked up and said she didn't need it anymore. She just needed him to live. If he died, she would be ready to kill people indiscriminately again. If he ran away, then she didn't know what to do. Deoki gently told her that he didn't run away but died. For him, this was the only and last way to teach her a new lesson. She kept crying loudly and said she didn't need him to teach her anymore. After saying that, she dragged him to do surgery right away, but he was really angry. He scolded her and even beat her. He then left a phone in front of her, saying that he would call her if necessary. Despite Seoke's tears, Deoki was determined to drive away. Seoke could only wait helplessly. Finally, the day came. The whole team gathered at Yonshin Hospital. Seoke went to see Professor Deoki for the last time before the surgery. It had been less than a month and he looked extremely haggard. He wanted to shake her hand, but she flatly refused. Seoke told him to shake her hand and thank her after the surgery. She insisted that she would not fail. Finally, the life and death surgery began. Seoke closed her eyes and took a deep breath before performing brain surgery on him. After a while, Nahi returned the dogs to Seoke. It turned out that she did not kill them, but only hid them temporarily. Seoke was also invited by a chairman to perform surgery on him. His hospital was famous for its neurosurgery department, but he did not trust his own doctor, but trusted Seoke. Seoke did not start immediately, but waited for someone. Finally, that person walked in and it was none other than Professor Deoki. Above is the entire content of the movie. Thank you for your interest in watching. Goodbye, and see you again in the next videos.